Hi, folks. You're with Tassless today. Tassless today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the extent and the level and the magnitude of corruption and wastage and the squandering of money and opportunity and so on in Africa. Now, you would think that the talk around, particularly in globalist type leftist circles, is that the reason the African nations are all basket cases. Okay, there's a bit of corruption, yeah, but hey, the real issue is it's those damn white, fascist colonialists that destroyed everything, and that's why these places are in such dire straits. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is that pretty much all of these African states, not every one, but pretty much all of them were in, when the white colonialists left, were quite wealthy. They were well-run regions with, government administration, Western public services, courts, first world standard port and shipping facilities, rail networks, airports. They had the whole business. And when the independence movement sort of took hold, particularly after World War II, and with maximum Soviet agitation, communist agitation, and penetrate, pretty much all of the independence leaders in Africa who'd been schooled in Marxist ideology and tactics of agitation and stirring the pot and so on, and raising class consciousness of the masses, the whole thing. So they'd been to Moscow for training, and they were effectively Soviet communist insurgents in their own country. So this idea that they were just, we want the nation for the black people, so that's bullshit. It was they were all trained agitators, with some exceptions. Now, what brought this home was I was looking at some articles about the amount of investment given to the African nations since they acquired independence from the colonial powers, Britain and so on. And I was staggered at the amount of money and the resources and the giveaways, the handouts and so on that's been extended to these African. Not only, just consider this, that they've inherited already a wealthy nation state generating a surplus with a functioning bureaucracy, with again, all the infrastructure in place, rail and the whole thing, electricity networks, and they've got all that sort of stuff there, roads, things that didn't exist before the white people turned up. Bear in mind that even Africans in the mid 1800s, they were still, majority of them still hadn't discovered the wheel. Just to give you some sort of perspective on this. So that the white colonial powers were leaving behind a fully functioning, wealthy, with a trade surplus. It would be impossible, you would say, to fuck it up. Now, on top of that, in addition to that, they've received, over the last 70 odd years, gargantuan level handouts over the time. Now, some of these handouts have come with strings attached, and they haven't always been handouts that have been productive. For example, they've been given, years' supply of wheat and grain and meal, this sort of stuff, and that turns some areas, some situations, into one of dependency rather than self-sufficiency. But they inherited and acquired a self-sufficient state. Now, once the agitation reached fever pitch and recovering from World War II, places like France and Britain, they wanted to concentrate on really domestic issues and putting in place a welfare state, all these sort of things, which are quite expensive. And they really didn't want it to stay in the colonial situation for longer than they had to. So they were pretty keen and motivated to get out. I remember the backdrop of the Cold War at the time. So they didn't want to hang around. And now some say, well, they were, today it's now looked at, say, well, they were so desperate to get out of Africa that they they didn't leave it in a good enough state where it could be self-sufficient. I don't buy that for a second. Now, could they have stayed longer, and would that have helped? Well, maybe. But the Africans didn't want them to stay longer. So this wasn't a case of if they'd forced themselves on the Africans, they'd been accused of being fascists and Nazis and so on. If they left quickly, they're accused of being derelict in their duty. And so either way, it wasn't going to, the propaganda machine would have gone chasing after the white colonials here. The Americans also were putting quite a lot of pressure on the European powers to divest themselves of their colonies and this sort of thing. And there were strings attached there that the Americans, who were bankrolling the near bankrupt world that had been at war, well, hey, you need to do what we say, otherwise we're not going to give you any favourable loans, saying this to Britain and France and so on. So there was a bit of a stampede to get out. But that doesn't change the reality that these African states, again, places like Rhodesia, later on to be named Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and the list goes on of places that were in pretty good shape, and any sort of lower level, public servant administrator from a white country could have probably made a go of it. Any CEO of a white company could have made a go of it, and these places could have maintained at the very least the prosperity that they already had. Remember, they already had prosperity. It wasn't like they needed to go out and chase it. It was already there. And somewhere like Rhodesia, as an example, they were one of the most successful agricultural producing economies in the world, let alone Africa. So, and were accordingly very wealthy. They had very efficient farming practices and so on. Now, why and how did it all go to shit? It's interesting looking at the commentary today, because it's very much done through the lens of leftist, globalist sort of equity type attitudes. So, for example, the commentators on one article I'm reading conceded that in South Africa, which was run by the whites, that there was no corruption, the public services were efficiently delivered, electricity and water and everything, the rail, everything ran on time, airports were, the crime rate was very low. They concede all these things, which suggests a well-run, desirable state and a desirable economy and so on. And if you look at sort of 1960s newsreels or just general reels of places like Johannesburg, Cape Town, and so on, you're looking at a very serene, quiet, shopping districts, people going about their business. Then you look at down that exact same street today, and it's a mayhem of people milling about, criminals and all sorts of folks engaging in the most furtive sort of type behaviour. So it's a very different place than it was when the whites were running. Now, this article I've just got, I was just reading a little earlier today, it concedes South Africa was no corruption, it was well run, it was wealthy, and they sort of tick all the boxes to what would be a very successful society, but it was morally bankrupt because it didn't include blacks and give them absolute equality to the white people. And because of that, it gets a fail. It was a morally failed state, even though it was a successful state in every other thing. Now, they then go on to talk about the failed black state. Now, the commentators quite reluctantly sort of suggest that they failed. They do concede there was corruption, but try and sort of frame it as just a one-off. There was just this one black guy who was bad. Now, he just happened to have been replaced by another black guy who was bad, then replaced by another black guy who was bad, and so on. So they try and frame it as if it was just a one-off thing. It wasn't something endemic, that the corruption and the now, when you get every successful state, when the colonials were there, every successful state has become a basket case state. South Africa too now, since the blacks took over. Surely there's a pattern of behaviour there that's worth noting. Not so, according to modern commentators. Even sort of magazines, international business magazines that 30 years ago were really panning the Africans for their corruption and incompetence and ineptitude and wastage. Today, try and reframe it as, well, it's not really that bad, And anyway, the white people let them down, so it's still their fault. It's the colonials that did it, and that's why they made them do it, and so on. And even to the point where, well, it was slavery that made it happen. Without even admitting that African slavery today and then throughout all time was a major piece of commerce and a major method or device of intertribal behaviour. So they always like to bring it back to, well, it's white people's fault. White people did it. You can't blame these black people. And they keep on reducing the black people to status of 2-year-old children. It's not their fault. They didn't know. They were led astray by these evil white people. And of course, which just makes the situation a whole lot worse than just infantilizing all black people and saying, well, the only blame can ever be on the adults. It's those damn white people that did it, which of course is untrue, ridiculous, absurd, and rather missing the point. But when I was looking at the amount of money that the United Nations, World Bank, and so on. Now, this wasn't always cash. It wasn't they were just taking over a bunch of those. This was often things like donating aircraft to them, so they could operate an air fleet, passenger air fleet, or donating drilling machines so they could drill for wells in remote areas, or donating all sorts of equipment to build infrastructure, to help them build a dam, and so engineers would come over and build a dam for them, and so all these sorts of things. And if you start looking at the money that was poured in, that has been poured in, and continues to be poured into these places, saying, well, it's impossible, it could fail, it's just impossible. You've acquired, it was gifted to you, a wealthy economy with infrastructure and everything in place, intact. All you had to do was not fuck it up. That's all you had to do. And then on top of that, you've got handout after handout, gift after gift, and still you've got a basket case country. And again, using Zimbabwe there is just one of many examples. Look how rich South Africa was when the white people were running it. Look at it now; it's a basket case. So, but the wastage and the incompetence and the corruption. I really want to focus on corruption here, and inherent in that is the wastage. I recently came across a delegation from one of these basket case corrupt African countries, and at this conference I was at, it wasn't long ago, and this was a former French colony, and they were this whole group of people were there, and they were eating at the most expensive restaurants. There was the prostitutes, there was this, there was that, and they were living their expenditures were just monumental. They were all wearing, the men were wearing $10,000 suits and this sort of thing, and the women were their handbag, the handbags that the women had there would have been more than the annual pay of a lot of people. So these people aren't living an ordinary life. They're not there for public service. They're there to steal everything they can, and anything is nailed down, and they'll stick in their pockets or give it to their friends and relatives and concubines and whatever else. But the idea that they're there to represent their country or their people, or to make their people's lives better, or to improve them, or to deliver better outcomes and so on, they look at you rather quizzically as if you're insane for even suggesting or implying that. I have the power, I have the opportunity, I can take whatever I want and as much as I want. Why would I not do that? And this comes back to the behavior or the attitudes of black people that I've hired over the years, where I attempt to explain to them that them coming to me and wanting a higher salary, when all they do, the minute that an extra dollar goes in their pocket, they simply live a lifestyle they can't afford. It's better that they get their lifestyle more realistic and under control, and their expenses under control, rather than just trying to find ways of stealing more or getting more without having earned it. So, and the black people that come to me that are hired, that wanting more pay, their argument would be, well, I want to do these things. It makes me feel good to do them. Okay, I don't have the money to do it. It's costing me a lot, but it makes me feel good. Why would I not do something that makes me feel good? It makes me feel good. I need more money to do what makes me feel good. So you pay me more, and then I can feel good. No. that's not how it works, buddy. If you want to make more money, you must produce more. Work harder. Sell more widgets, or dig more holes, or whatever it is that you're doing. But you have to do it. That's how you make more money. But why can't you live within your means? If you can't afford to go out for dinner every night, then don't do it. But it makes me feel good. Why wouldn't I do it? It makes me feel. Why do you? That's white boy. That's white boy attitude. I feel good, and so this is really the same attitude that these. It seems to be a bit of a black thing, actually. These African dictators have. Hey, being able to steal all this stuff and take whatever I want when I want and give it to whoever I want, it makes me feel good. Why wouldn't I do it? I've got the power. I've got the opportunity. I don't have to go anyone and ask permission. I can just steal it, and it makes me feel good, so I'm going to do it. Those white boys buy $10,000 suits. I will too. It makes me feel good. And the fact that they don't have an economy that can support or subsidize such behavior, I don't care. It makes me feel good. So now the British in particular, probably more so than the other colonial powers, took the view that they would select the most westernized black people they could, who in the British view were the least tribal and had the most Western education, and try and put them in charge as put them in as the president or the prime minister, create a government when the British left, create a government around these mostly westernized black people. Many of whom had some sort of public service training, either being deputies for British people in Africa, or they'd gone to work as effectively interns, I guess you'd call it, in Britain for the public service there. So they had a cadre of people, a class of people, black Africans, who were Western educated, had lived in the West for quite a while, and were educated and experienced in the ways of government administration, public service, and indeed some of the private sector type things, running a mine or running a railway, or those sorts of things. And yet this failed too. There was one of the people that the British picked. He's a guy who'd left Africa at the age of 19 or 20, and he'd lived in the West for something like 30 years. And he was a university educated. The British rated him as quite a bright guy, and he'd been out of Africa for so long, he wasn't able to speak the local African tribal language anymore, that he really only could speak English. And so they kind of installed him as, or gave him their support. He ultimately became the prime minister. They departed, but almost within minutes or days of the British departing, all his Africanness came back, and he turned into a corrupt, genocidal maniac, power hungry, a tyrannical dictator. Now, this is a guy again who left Africa at sort of the age of 20. He'd lived in the West for 30 years, but he reverted straight back to mean, the mean standard, the median, if you like, straight back to the African median within and power seems to very quickly corrupt certain people and not others. And again, this guy became a tyrannical dictator. And within 15 years, the wealthy state was bankrupt. The railways are no longer being maintained. Now, it wasn't that the thought hadn't been given. For example, he would find some useless parasitic goon and say, well, you're in charge of maintaining the railways, another black guy, and you've got a budget of $100 million or whatever, and you have to maintain the railways by the new. This was theoretically, as the British would have left it, this was theoretically the guy's job. But the guy was, well, you've given me $100 million, that's going into my pocket, buddy. Screw the railways, screw the maintenance. You can shove the railway tracks, where the sun don't shine. I'm taking all that money and I'm living the life of a a dictator here, or a rich magnate, and so that money would get wasted. Then there'd be money allocated to maintaining the ports or the roads of this, and that was then all taken away. The Western nations or the United Nations would be aghast at how the whole place is spiraling out of control. So they come along, well, look, we'll give you more money to maintain the roads and the ports, which meant that just more money would go into the pockets of the corrupt and the wastage and so on. They would then subcontract it out to other useless goons who also would pocket the money. And then you look at a place like South Africa today, where the railway tracks and the railways, so everything is being looted by people for just a quick buck or whatever. I'm stealing it because I can. So there's a breakdown of law and order. The police are corrupt and everyone's on the take. So no one does what they're supposed to do. Now, it doesn't take long when that happens for things to spiral quickly out of control, and the trade surpluses that you're exporting or were being exported, they've all disappeared as well. So not only have you destroyed the wealth that's there, you've destroyed the possibility of recurring wealth, trade surplus, that's all gone to shit. And then when you get help on a large scale from the World Bank, those sorts of things, then you squander that as well. And this seems to be the African disease, and they just can't not do it. And again, South Africa was a rich first world nation when the blacks took over. Look at it now. I mean, what a basket case. So it goes up, but I hadn't realised the extent of the handouts that the Africans had received. Now, with hindsight, was that a good thing to say, well, we'll look after your starving, we'll give you 3 years of grain supply, wheat or corn or whatever. We'll give you 3 years of grain supply, so you won't have to worry about feeding the populace. So then the government, the Black African government doesn't do anything about making sure that crops are being planted and there's harvesting and that the roads are in good order and that the warehousing for storage is in good order. All the things that need to be done to create an efficient, functioning agricultural and economic sector is just completely disregarded. And so it all falls into a state of disrepair and ultimately ruin. And whilst a handful of people become very, very rich and really don't care, I have the power to do it. It makes me feel good. I'm going to do it. Why wouldn't I do it? It's only you silly white people that, and so without that planning ahead and showing of restraint and so on, this is how quickly it happens. Was it ever a good idea to hand over, control to the local black tribes, for a moral basis? Sure. Well, independence and self-determination. It all sounds very good when you're talking about it in a university debating sort of schoolroom or lecture hall, but the reality on the ground is very different. That tens of millions of Africans have died as a result of the neglect of their own leaders that would not have died had the Europeans been in control. So why don't we talk about that? You've been fantastic today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.